Hey, Fae folk, welcome back. Real quick, apologies if I seem sort of nervous or disheveled. I just had to kill a really big bug, and I am not, in fact, being very brave about it. But that's not why we're here. Obviously, we don't talk about bugs really on the channel. We're here to talk about dolls. And so this is actually a topic that, I have thought about for so long, and I feel like it's something that, also just kind of crops up in collector spaces sometimes. I'm sure a lot of you guys have thought about this, and that is, what exactly is a doll? More specifically, a fashion doll, just because if you broaden it out to any type of doll, that gets crazy. That's impossible to define. But I've long been interested in the concept of what makes a fashion doll, and especially the difference between a doll versus an action figure versus sort of a figurine. Definitely figurines I think are more in a camp on their own because they tend to be completely stationary and really just for display. But action figures and dolls, there's just such an interesting blurry line between the two, and I think it's really interesting to try to define what exactly makes a doll, or like I said in this case, a fashion doll. So I opened it up to you guys on the community tab here. I asked you how you specifically would define a fashion doll and what differentiates it from action figures and figurines to you. So huge shout out to all of the people who responded, because I would not be able to be making this video if none of you guys had commented back to me. I'm not going to be reading out every single comment just because there were a lot, and a lot of them did say very similar things. But even if yours isn't specifically featured here, I do just want to say thank you for answering, because it was very helpful. So today I want to try to answer the question, what exactly makes a fashion doll a fashion doll? And I'm going to be using your comments and your definitions to try to accomplish that. So let's just jump on into it. So we're going to start out with something nice and simple, and that is, when I think of action figures and figurines, I think of them as a singular painted item, no removable clothes or rooted hair. And I do think that this is a good place to start, because it's also what I immediately think of when I think doll. I think of removable fashion and rooted, brushable hair, because those are just the most common ways that dolls are enjoyed and played with. So I think that's what I tend to think of first, and what many other people think of first. But that is obviously not always the case. Before we get into that though, I just want to read a couple more comments that were kind of along that same vein, just to show that this is really a common conception and what people seem to tend to think of. So someone commented simply, for me, it's a doll with removable clothing and rooted hair. Someone else said, fashion dolls come with removable fashion that can be mixed and matched. I see dolls with painted on or molded on plastic tops or clothes as partially fashion dolls, which I do think is really interesting. That muddies the waters even more if something can be somewhat of a fashion doll. I do think that's kind of an interesting concept, and honestly totally fair, because it's a fashion doll, especially when you add that term in, fashion, having something to do with the clothes does feel sort of quintessential to it actually being a fashion doll. So definitely that makes sense. Someone else replied, also, I'm not using any names just because I know that comments are public and other people can see them, but I just don't like drawing intense attention to people's comments unless they have expressly stated that they're fine with that. So I'm not showing screenshots or anything. I'm just reading them out. If you want to claim your comment, that's fine. I'm not trying to put your business out there, because I do feel there's a difference between commenting on a community post and having your comment and your username and everything read out in a video. I don't know, whatever. Anyway, someone else said, emphasis on current trends, removable fashions, and articulation. And I did think that was a really interesting addition to that sort of broad definition of the clothing and the hair. And now we're adding an articulation, but especially the emphasis on current trends, because that is definitely something that we tend to see a lot with fashion dolls. I mean, it's really cool with dolls like Barbie, where you can look at how Barbie has evolved and how her fashion has evolved and how it has kind of followed what's popular at any given point in time. And Barbie's just such a great example because she's been around for so long, so you can really see the clear differences in the fashion that was on Barbie when it was the 70s or whatever versus Barbie nowadays. They're completely different styles of fashion because the brand is obviously trying to keep up with what's currently in trend. And I do think that's a really important and interesting addition. Last one that's kind of along the same line is, I'd usually consider a fashion doll one that's fully articulated and posable with many details on their bodies, clothes, accessories, and such, something you'd really want to display. So we are getting more of that definition of articulation in there, which I do understand as someone who is a bit of an articulation snob myself. I definitely prefer dolls that have a lot more articulation to dolls that don't have as much articulation. But here's where I want to start to question things, because like I said, this is the sort of definition that I would give you, if you just like asked me on the street, oh, what's a fashion doll? I'd be like, oh, it's like a doll that has parts that can move. Maybe some have more, some have less, but like there's some articulation there. There's brushable hair and there's clothes that you can take off. But that isn't always the case. And it does, like, I'm not trying to say you're wrong if you don't think these dolls are fashion dolls, because it is subjective. That's like the whole point of the video. Because then you get into dolls like there's a Barbie doll that doesn't have hair. Obviously, that then doesn't fill the rooted hair requirement, like she's bald. But also, some people are bald by choice, some people aren't bald by choice for like various different reasons. And having a doll that represents that, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a fashion doll. And again, I'm not trying to say that anyone commented that a fashion doll has to have rooted hair is like excluding bald dolls on purpose, because that's not what I think is happening here. It's just begging an interesting question. But then you might be like, okay, well, bald is like completely different. Like having a doll that very intentionally doesn't have hair is different. And I can absolutely see where that would like still sort of fall into that category, because it's like, even if it doesn't have rooted hair, it might still be like a stylistic choice. But then we have dolls that do have molded on hair. Going with sort of the Barbie theming that we're looking at here, a lot of Ken dolls do not come with rooted hair. They just have sort of short plastic molded on hair. And it's like, does that mean that those Kens aren't fashion dolls? I don't know. Maybe it kind of depends on your definition, because to me, I'm like, yeah, they still are. But also that is at odds with what I would usually define a fashion doll as. And then it's not even limited to Kens. I found this particular image I just thought was really, really interesting. This is a color reveal Barbie. And I know a lot of the color reveals, like, they've had so many different lines. Some of them have had like hair, some of them haven't. This one has like molded on base hair, and then it has pieces that you can add on. So there are some plastic pieces that look like they're buns. And then there are also little like attachments that you can kind of stick into the holes on the head that do have hair rooted in. So then that's also an interesting question, because this baseline Barbie doesn't come with rooted hair like attached to her head, but there's an option to add it on there, but there's also an option to add on more molded hair. So it's just, this is where the blurry line comes in. This is where it becomes really interesting, because is she not a fashion doll because all of her hair isn't rooted? Even though you can change the style of the hair, it's just not in like the typical way that you might think of. I think this is very fascinating. Like, I'm really like getting into it because I just think this is such an interesting question. And then to bring up another question, a lot of those comments did mention articulation. And like, I will admit that I personally can't think of any fashion dolls that have absolutely zero articulation, but there are some that have significantly less, like the most recent like budget lineup for Monster High, the Buried Secrets lineup. These dolls have very, very limited articulation. There's articulation at the neck, shoulders, wrists, and hips, and that's it. And there are definitely dolls also that don't even have like the wrist articulation like these do. So there are dolls that fulfill other requirements, like the Buried Secrets dolls do have removable clothing and they do have rooted hair, but they're very, very limited on the articulation front. So it's like, at what point do we lose so much articulation that it no longer fulfills the requirement of like that for the definition of a doll? I do think it's kind of interesting. And then this one was super, super fascinating to me, just because I hadn't really thought about this necessarily, but someone commented, I think it's a 1/6 scale doll that focuses on a particular fashion or outfit. It has rooted hair that can be changed into particular hairstyles. I guess to me, hair is also fashion. So between the outfit and hair, they can be changed. And so like a lot of that definition is still the same as what we had seen before, but adding in the 1/6 scale, I think is super, super interesting, because that is the sort of most common fashion doll scale. That's like the same scale that Barbie or like Monster High would sort of be. Obviously, proportions come into that, and like definitely not all 1/6 scale dolls have the same proportions. I mean, if you stand a Rainbow High doll by a Barbie doll, very, very different, like head size mostly, but just like a lot of the proportions are different, but they would still sort of be considered that same 1/6 scale, where they're roughly around like the 10 to 12 inches in height is sort of what we're talking about when we say that scale. But then something like the Magic Mixie's Pixlings, to me, I would still consider a fashion doll, especially when you look at ones that are a little bit more deluxe, like Angelica, who does have a fully removable dress. She does have like slightly limited articulation, but she does still have articulation, and she has rooted hair. But she's too small to be considered a 1/6 scale. I think technically speaking, she would be a 1/12 scale. So then like, does she not count? And again, I'm not trying to call out the commenter and be like, you're wrong. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying it's so fascinating. And then even to look at things like the fashion Polly Pockets, obviously like the most iconic, I think Polly Pockets are the ones in the tiny little cases that are super, super, super small. And like, personally, I would not call that a fashion doll. I mean, you can't change like the hair or the clothing, and there's not really articulation. That's like a completely separate thing. But fashion polys that are a little bit bigger, they still are definitely not the 1/6 scale, but they are a little bit bigger. They have some articulation. Usually the hair is like plastic, but it sometimes could be, depending on like the line, because there were a few different iterations of these sort of fashion polys, but sometimes you could like change the hair or add on like a ponytail or pigtails or whatever. You could snap in different things, and they come with removable rubber clothing. Does rubber clothing still count? Like, it's not fashion in the traditional sense that like humans might think of it, because most people wear cloth clothing, not plastic clothing. Obviously, if you do, that's chill, like plastic pieces, that can be fun, but it's not something that's as common. So like, this doll doesn't necessarily have the rooted hair, but you can sometimes change the hair out. So does that still count for something? The clothes might not be like fabric, but they are still changeable. So you can change the fashion. Does that inherently mean that these are in fact fashion dolls? Fashion Polly? And then like with the limited articulation with the scale, it's just really fascinating to see how these things both do and don't fit into this sort of more common perception of what is a fashion doll. This comment I found super, super fascinating. This person said, I don't know if it's necessarily how I'd define it, but action figures and figurines both tend to be entirely made of one material, be it plastic, resin, rubber, or whatever. Fashion dolls tend to have a variety of materials. You have your standard doll with brushable hair and fabric clothes, but some dolls have fully molded hair or rubber clothes, like the Polly Pockets we just talked about. There's pretty much always some variance in materials. Even with the capsule chicks where it's all plastic, the skirts and shoes are a different type of plastic from the rest of the doll. And I just think that's a really interesting concept, because I personally hadn't considered that. Like, I was thinking of different traits when I think of how to define a doll rather than what it's made of and like how those pieces interact. But I do think that that is sort of an interesting way to define a doll, especially because I think that all the ones we've talked about then do fit into that like specific definition of being different materials, where even if the hair is molded on, it's like sort of a different material, and then there might be like non-molded on clothing, so then that doll all of a sudden does have two different materials, makes it sort of a doll. I think it's it's not what I thought of, but I think it is sort of valid. I mean, all the dolls, like I said, that we've used as examples today do technically fit this criteria. So not how I would define it, but like it makes sense. And then another comment that gave me pause said, I collect fashion dolls and 1/6 scale action figures and have been thinking how to compare them. I'd say fashion dolls tend to have fairly unrealistic proportions and also traditionally don't have a lot of articulation, though that is changing thanks to bodies like Made to Move. The focus is on outfits and displaying them, and also hair play. There seems to always be more female fashion dolls than male ones. 1/6 scale action figures often have more realistic faces and proportions and more articulation. The focus is less on outfits/fashion and more on posability and setting up realistic 1/6 scale scenes. Sorry, I can't talk today. There seems to be more male action figures than female ones, and they often have a military theme. So that is like specifically within like the, not just how do you define a doll, but like how does a doll compare to an action figure? Those are really, really good points in terms of there's a different focus on what the intention of that particular toy might be. There also is definitely a difference in the marketing. Action figures tend to be marketed towards boys, so therefore it makes sense that most of them tend to be male, and then fashion dolls tend to be marketed towards girls, hence why mostly they are female, although of course there's overlap. Boys can play with dolls, girls can play with action figures. Y'all know the drill. Gender is like a myth. But yeah, like in general, in marketing and in like how society sees these two different things, that is a really, really good distinction and a really, really good point. And I think that it is sort of impossible to ignore the fact that marketing does have a lot to do with the differences between action figures and dolls specifically. And sort of leaning into that, I think that these last two comments that I wanted to highlight really helped answer this question for me specifically. So they are like a little bit long, but I think it's worth it. So please bear with me as I read these, or attempt to read these like without stuttering over my words. So the first one says, internally, my definition is a doll line that centers around clothes, makeup, and aesthetics that the toy has to offer. Generally, one of the draws to the doll is centered around play, with the clothes being a primary factor incorporated into the design of the doll. I find figures function are primarily for display, even if they do have fabric clothes, for example. Interrupting for a second, but that actually does totally make sense because there are some like anime figurines that do come with fabric clothes, but like you're not necessarily supposed to be. I mean, obviously you can if you buy it, like it's your stuff, you can do whatever. But like the intent isn't necessarily to be changing the clothes very frequently. It's to dress them how you want to and then set them on your shelf and just like look at them. So definitely I know what this person's talking about. And then to continue, and action figures function are generally to be played with in a way where everything remains intact without having to think of potentially losing each individual clothing piece, and also has a focus on durability to the forefront as well. Sorry, I just like can't read, as I said. That's not to say fashion dolls don't want to be durable, but you compromise the level of durability when making a fashion doll as opposed to the action figure. The action figure's purpose is meant to be thrown, tossed around, stepped on, and potentially ran over and remain intact. And then like the sort of implication there, I'm adding this on, so sorry if I'm kind of incorrect, but fashion dolls are not necessarily designed to be roughhoused as much with the play. Like they definitely are meant to be played with in a way that is more almost creative. And hi, I don't know if you guys heard that, but Reese has joined us once again. Hi, baby girl, I love you. But yeah, fashion dolls are more like, oh, change the clothes, change the hair, brush the hair, like whatever the case might be. Whereas action figures, it's literally in the name, action. You might be playing a little bit more roughly with those things. And I think this is such a cool way to reframe it because, as I've said a couple times now, when I think of how to define a fashion doll or a doll in general, I think of the traits that that doll comes with: articulation, hair, clothing, that sort of thing. And obviously a lot of other people do as well. But it might be easier to define a doll if we define it based on how it's played with and what the primary function of that toy is. So to read the last comment that definitely ties into that kind of idea, this person said, in my opinion, if the primary play function is dressing and or styling the figure, it's a fashion doll. Things like scale, articulation, clothing material, or body style, humanoid versus not, are specifications. I'd argue color change or customizable dolls, transforming dolls, and styling heads also count because even if the clothing isn't fully removable, the intended play is still centered around changing the aesthetic appearance of the figure. And I just like, that's such an interesting concept because that's not at all like how my brain works when I'm asked the question, or even when I pose myself the question of what is a fashion doll or what is a doll. But like decentering the traits that a doll or a toy has and recentering what it's used for, I think is honestly a really good way to define a fashion doll. To add in some more discourse here, it is kind of interesting because then it's like, what about dolls that are sort of more almost on like the bath toy side of things? That's like the easiest way I think I can put it. But like a lot of mermaid dolls are designed specifically to be in the water. That's why we see a lot of mermaid dolls that aren't the kind that I want to see, which is like a fashion mermaid doll. But we see a lot of mermaid dolls that are almost entirely plastic except for the hair so that they can be submerged in water and there's like less chance of anything getting damaged or like having all these different parts that have to dry out. Or even like swimsuit dolls. There's swimsuit Barbies where, you know, they might have rooted hair, but the entire outfit is molded on so that again, it can easily go into the water. So at that point, like the play aspect is not necessarily centered on fashion or changing the hair, or changing the clothes. It might be centered on water play, but they still kind of feel like fashion dolls to me. At least, again, like that's just in my head. Y'all might disagree, and that's perfectly fine. But in my head, I'm like, that still kind of feels like a fashion doll. It doesn't help, too, kind of going back to the marketing thing, that so many of these are produced by the same brands. Like you might find a true fashion doll that is a Barbie, but then you might have a bath toy that's a Barbie, or a Barbie with no hair molded on hair. So it's like, does the brand that's manufacturing the doll then also factor into what makes it a fashion doll as opposed to a different type of doll? There's a lot of questions. So where exactly does that leave us? I don't have an answer. I kind of did a little white lie at the beginning of the video where I was like, we're going to try to answer the question of what makes a fashion doll a fashion doll. But really, I wanted to make this video to highlight the fact that I don't think I can do that. Like, I set out being like, oh, maybe everyone's going to have the same sort of answers and we actually can define what makes a fashion doll a fashion doll. And I do think that we've gotten close, at least in my opinion, because again, you guys might disagree and that's chill. It's obviously not a serious topic, but I definitely think that the people who pointed out that function might have more to do with what makes a fashion doll are sort of on the right track to my brain. I think that that makes sense because it can encapsulate so many different varieties when it comes to hair, clothes, or scale, or whatever the case might be. So that helps encapsulate that. But then again, you get the like mermaid dolls that sort of trip you up. So I don't know that for me personally, I really can define what makes a fashion doll. Like the line between fashion dolls and other types of dolls and action figures truly is such a blurry one. And I think that's okay. There doesn't have to be like a super specific definition. To me, I'm perfectly happy with it being a very vague or a definition that like can change and fluctuate over time. I just think this is a really fun thought experiment. I think it's really, really interesting to hear what other people think of, and also like how so many people do tend to think the same way about things like the hair and the clothing. Like those do feel quintessential fashion dolls, but they don't always have to be there. So yeah, this was just kind of a little thought experiment video. This is probably going to be a bit of a quicker one, but I hope it was interesting to you guys anyway. If you didn't see the community post and you want to add your definition for a fashion doll in the comments, or if like your definition has changed after watching this video, I would still love to hear your thoughts on how you would personally define a fashion doll, because it's just like such an odd gray area. But the important part, I think, is that fashion dolls are things that we as doll collectors love, probably. I would assume that if you're watching this channel specifically, you love fashion dolls. And they're things that bring us joy, and that's what's really important. But yeah, that's going to be it for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed this little thoughtful episode. Oh my God. Like I'm something official. That's kind of embarrassing. This thoughtful little video. I'm going to go. I hope you guys do have a lovely rest of your day or your night, whatever it might be, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye, guys.